Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you'd like to submit a story, feel free to do so in the comments down below, or send it to my email. Alright, let's dive into today's story now. You know those moments that change your life forever? The ones that split everything into a before and an after? That's what the car crash was for me. It happened on a rainy Tuesday night. The kind of rain that makes everything blurry and the roads feel like ice. Sarah and I were driving back from dinner. We were arguing, though now I can't even remember what it was about. Something petty, probably. Something that didn't matter. We were mid-sentence, voices raised, and then, bam! Tires screeched, metal crunched. The world spun like a broken carousel. My ears filled with the sound of shattering glass and Sarah's scream. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My head ached, and my body felt like it had been hit by a truck, which I guess it had. My left arm was wrapped in a cast, and there were bruises everywhere. But it wasn't bad, not compared to Sarah. The doctor told me she was in a coma. She'd suffered a traumatic head injury and they weren't sure she'd make it. The words barely registered. It felt like I was underwater, everything muffled and slow. I spent the next 3 weeks by her side, holding her hand, whispering to her, begging her to wake up, to come back to me. And then, one cold morning, she did. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at me, confused and fragile. I remember feeling this overwhelming wave of relief, like my heart had finally started beating again. It was a miracle, they said. The kind of recovery you don't see every day. But sometimes miracles come with a price. At first, everything felt normal, or at least as normal as it could be after an accident like that. Sarah was quiet, tired, and a little out of it. The doctors said it was typical after such a trauma. She needed rest. I brought her home a few days later. Our little apartment felt different, but I figured it was just me. We were both trying to settle back into our lives. I told myself it would just take time. But then, the weird stuff started happening. It was small things at first. I'd catch her watching me from across the room, not saying anything, just staring, her eyes a little too wide. Her gaze felt off, like she wasn't really seeing me. And then there were the smiles. They weren't her usual smiles. They were stretched too far, showing too much teeth. The kind of smile that makes your stomach twist into knots. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe she was trying to lighten the mood. Maybe she was just coping with everything in her own way. But then one night, everything changed. I was in the kitchen making dinner. The only light came from the overhead lamp above the stove. I was chopping vegetables when I felt it. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I turned around, expecting to see Sarah sitting at the table. But she wasn't there. Instead, she was peeking at me from behind the kitchen wall. Just her head, tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth stretched into that same eerie smile. Her fingers gripped the edge of the wall so tightly that her knuckles were white. I felt my heart skip a beat. "Sarah, what are you doing?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring, her smile frozen in place. And then slowly she disappeared back behind the wall. I stood there, knife trembling in my hand, my brain trying to catch up with what I'd just seen. A chill ran down my spine. Something was very wrong. The next few days were a blur. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself I was overreacting. She'd just been through a lot. Maybe she was dealing with trauma. Maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. But it got worse. Her smiles became more twisted, more unnatural, and she started making these sounds. Low, raspy groans that would come out of nowhere. I'd be reading a book, and suddenly from the corner of the room I'd hear this horrible noise. It sounded like metal scraping against metal, or someone trying to clear their throat while choking. One night, I woke up to one of those sounds. It was a deep, guttural groan coming from the foot of the bed. My heart pounded as I sat up, my eyes straining to see in the dark. There she was, standing at the foot of the bed, her head hanging forward so that her hair covered most of her face. But through the strands, I could see her eyes, wide, bloodshot, staring at me with that awful intensity. "Sarah, are you okay?" She didn't respond. Instead, she made that noise again, a long, raspy groan that seemed to vibrate in my bones. Then she turned and walked out of the room, her steps slow and deliberate. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, watching me. I started questioning everything. Was this really Sarah? Or was it just some twisted version of her? Something the accident had brought back in her place? I didn't know. And that terrified me. The next morning, I tried to shake off the nightmare that had become my life. Maybe she needed help, professional help. But every time I brought it up, Sarah would just smile that twisted, unsettling smile and say, "I'm fine, don't worry." It was getting harder to believe her. That afternoon, I sat in the living room, pretending to read a book while keeping one eye on her. She was in the kitchen, but something felt off. The air was thick, like it was waiting for something to happen. I could hear her moving around, the occasional clink of a dish or the scrape of a chair against the floor. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft, almost too quiet to make out. It was my name. Ben. My fingers tightening around the book. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, a little more desperate. "Ben." I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. "Sarah?" I called out. There was no answer. I walked toward the kitchen, each step feeling like I was walking into a trap. The whispering continued, growing more frantic, more distorted. When I finally rounded the corner, the kitchen was empty, but the whispers were still there. "Ben, Ben." They seemed to be coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air around me. I spun in place, trying to find the source, panic clawing at my throat. Then I saw it. A shadow. It was standing just beyond the doorway, tall and distorted, like someone was stretched out of proportion. The shadow moved slightly, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it was peeking around the corner, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow twitched, and then slowly, it disappeared. I didn't move for a long time. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But nothing made sense anymore. This wasn't just Sarah acting weird. This was something else. Something wrong. That night, sleep was out of the question. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every nerve in my body on high alert. The apartment was silent, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive, like it was hiding something. I kept glancing at the doorway, half expecting to see Sarah standing there, her eyes wide and unblinking, that awful smile on her face. But the doorway remained empty. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off, my exhaustion outweighing my fear. I woke up to the feeling of someone breathing on my face. My eyes snapped open, and there she was. Sarah, inches from my face, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her mouth twisted into that grotesque grin. Her breath was hot and foul, and her fingers were digging into the mattress on either side of my head. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Ben, she whispered, why don't you smile more? I let out a strangled scream and pushed her away. She fell back onto the floor, but she didn't stop smiling. She just lay there, staring up at me, her body twisted in an unnatural position. I scrambled out of bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. What the hell is wrong with you? I yelled. She didn't answer. She just kept smiling. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment. I didn't care that I was barefoot, that I was still in my pajamas. I just needed to get away. I drove around for hours trying to clear my head, trying to make sense of what was happening. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the image of her face. That twisted, terrifying smile burned into my brain. I pulled into an empty parking lot, the car jerking to a stop as my trembling hands gripped the wheel. My whole body shook, my breathing uneven and shallow. I stared out through the rain-speckled windshield, trying to steady myself, but the image of Sarah's twisted face wouldn't leave my mind. It felt like it was burned into my vision, haunting me with every blink. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat, my fingers shaking as I scrolled through my contacts. I stopped at Jake's name and pressed call, holding the phone tightly to my ear. Ben? Jake's voice came through. What's going on? I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight. I forced the words out. Jake, I need to see you. Please, can we meet? Meet? Ben, are you okay? You sound just... Please, Jake, I interrupted. I need to talk to you. There was a pause on the other end before Jake sighed. All right, where do you want to meet? I rattled off the address of a diner I knew was open late. He agreed to meet me there, and I hung up without another word. I sat there for a moment, gripping the phone tightly, trying to steady my breathing. The rain tapped against the car roof, the sound only amplifying the storm in my head. I started the engine and drove toward the diner, the shaking in my hands refusing to stop. I sat in the corner booth of the old diner, my hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. The place was nearly empty, but I felt eyes on me. Imaginary or not, I couldn't tell anymore. The door jingled and Jake walked in, his face tired and creased with concern. He slid into the seat across from me, frowning. Dude, you look like hell, he said. What's going on? I swallowed hard. It's Sarah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She's been different. She watches me, smiles in this way that just... I shuddered. It freaks me out, man. I don't know what to do. Jake's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward. Ben, what are you talking about? I rubbed my temples, my head throbbing. Since the accident, she's just not the same. It's like she's someone else. I don't know how to explain it, but she's scaring me. He stared at me for a long moment, his face clouding with confusion. Ben, listen, I need you to hear me, okay? Sarah didn't make it out of that crash. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I blinked at him. What? She died, Ben. She was in a coma for weeks and she didn't wake up. We buried her. You gave the eulogy. You don't remember? I felt like the floor was falling away beneath me. My heart pounded in my ears. No, you're wrong. She's been with me. She's home right now. Jake shook his head slowly. You've been through a lot. Maybe you're seeing things. But she's gone, man. I couldn't breathe. The walls of the diner seemed to close in. My chair scraped against the floor as I stood up. I need to go home, I mumbled. Ben, wait, Jake called after me. But I was already halfway out the door. The cold air hit me like a slap. I didn't look back. I had to see for myself. Had to prove him wrong. Or maybe deep down, I just needed to know the truth. The drive home felt like a fever dream. My mind was stuck on Jake's words. Sarah didn't survive the crash. It didn't make sense. How could she be dead when I'd been living with her for weeks? I pulled into the driveway, my hands trembling on the wheel. The house sat there in the rain-soaked gloom, dark and silent. I took a shaky breath and stepped out of the car, the cold rain soaking through my clothes as I rushed to the front door. "Sarah?" I called, pushing the door open. The silence inside was suffocating. I stepped into the house and looked around. Everything was where it should be. The couch, the coffee table, the framed photo of us on the wall. But something was missing. The air felt hollow, like the place had been abandoned for years. "Sarah," I called louder, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. Nothing. I checked the kitchen. Empty. The knife from the other night was still on the cutting board. It felt like a snapshot of a moment frozen in time. I moved down the hallway, my footsteps too loud in the silence. The bedroom door was half open. I pushed it wide, expecting to see her sitting on the bed, waiting for me. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the blankets perfectly smooth. Her clothes weren't in the closet. Her shoes weren't by the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved to the bathroom. The mirror was clean, the counter bare. No toothbrush, no hair ties, nothing. I went through the house again, room by room. The guest room, the hallway closet, the living room. I opened drawers, checked under the bed, searched every corner. There wasn't a single trace of her. It was like she had never been here. I collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands. My thoughts raced, trying to piece together a puzzle that refused to fit. How could she just be gone? How could everything feel so empty? And then it hit me. A sick, cold realization spread through my veins. I realized that I had always been alone, and I also realized that I wasn't alone.